my granddaughter was building a make-believe house, and the house had rooms. It had a kitchen, it had a bedroom, it had a playroom, and then it also had a safe room. She built a safe room in her little house that she built. I mean, that says a lot. That's I kind of stopped me short.
I'm Melanie Marshall. For over 20 years, I traveled the world for BBC News, going to so many amazing places and meeting great people from across the spectrum of human experience. Jerusalem is special to me. Israel is special. I lived there for 4 years. That's why I wanted to bring you this conversation with Joel Greenberg, legendary journalist, advisor to me, and a friend.
Yeah, I mean, Israeli character, I don't know what that is. If there's different Israelis. I think the main part is that Israel it's not a monolith. It's anything but. It's like different tribes and different types of people. And that's the main thing I think about Israel that people maybe miss. Israel is not their government necessarily.
When you hear him talk about his family, about his grandchildren, it really brings home the impact that this war has had, this conflict has on Israelis, on people living there.
The war was such a huge event, and the loss of life and suffering in Gaza was so tremendous that it was really an interesting case study to see how does a society deal with that, or how does a society move on with its life without really paying too much attention to it. I think that Israelis did not see the tremendous suffering. You saw it more where you are, and people abroad saw it. Israelis did not. And so some of the reaction was, oh, they hate us. You know, why are they protesting over there? Why is everybody up in arms?
Joel's hopes for the future are for peace. And what I hope is that when you listen to this interview, you will listen with an open mind and a compassionate heart. Basically, listen like Joel does. So the story I tell everybody when I say, oh, I'm going to talk to Joel, is I talk about the night that the Iranian missiles were flying in 2025. And I messaged you to see if you and your family were okay. And you replied very matter-of-factly, yeah, we're in the Mamad, which is the shelter. And then you said, oh, I haven't shown you a picture of my latest grandkid. And immediately went... immediately switched to that. When I tell Israelis or a lot of my Jewish friends that story, they start laughing and they feel the like, okay, that's Israel. Like, to me, that's Israel. When I tell a lot of non-Israelis, they're like, oh, that poor man was in the bomb shelter. And it's interesting to me, the perception difference in that. So I don't know if you remember that, but like for me, that is such like a encapsulation of you and somewhat of the kind of Israeli spirit that I see.
Well, I mean, I think it's been, Israelis have integrated this. I mean, I've been covering this as a journalist, kind of observing it, but it's like but inevitably you live here, so you're part of it. You can't escape it. And it's basically, you incorporate this craziness into your daily life, believe it or not. And it occurred to me when you were telling that story about being in a safe room and showing you pictures of the grandchildren, my granddaughter was building a make-believe house. This is when they were in Tel Aviv. They've since moved, and we could talk about that later. But she was building a house, and the house had rooms. It had a kitchen, it had a bedroom, it had a playroom, and then it also had a safe room. She built a safe room in her little house that she built, which means that she had internalized somehow that this is part of what comes with a house, that a house also has a safe room where you have to go when sirens go off, which is, that says a lot. That's, I kind of stopped me short. On the other hand, it's a very practical, pragmatic response by a 6 or 7-year-old who is adjusting to reality, because in her life, there was a room they had to go to sometimes to be okay, to be safe. That's what she understood at that point. So in a way, it's incorporated into daily life in a way. It's hard to imagine that if you don't live here, but people have managed to do that. I mean, there's a price you pay for that, of course, I think, but people have incorporated that into their daily routine. It's not happening, but people are living with that in the back of their mind. And we've had more than 2 years, 2.5 more years of intermittent episodes of this. And so it's never, I think, far from anybody's mind. And safe rooms are part of the building code. If you build a new building in Israel, you have to have a safe room. It's just part of life. Hard to believe if you're coming from somewhere else, but here that's the way it is. Unfortunately, I would say. Well, I mean, I think there's a certain abnormality to it. I mean, it's not really normal. What's normal? I don't know if there is such a thing as normal, but in life, in normal, you don't really have to live with the idea that at some point, at certain times, you have to run into a safe room because missiles are going to fly and destroy buildings. And even a child like my granddaughter, who wasn't really told all the details, but understood that that was kind of a room where you go to be okay. A child shouldn't have that, really. I don't want my grandchildren to have that. I wouldn't want anybody to have that. Or my daughter-in-law figuring out if she's walking the little guy, her little baby, and suddenly siren goes off, how can she get to a safe room fast, when she's got him, she's carrying him or pushing him in a carriage. When she was pregnant, she was wondering about it. She can't run. These kind of thoughts and calculations, that's a price to pay. That's not something that you should normally be thinking about when you're going about your daily routine. That's what I mean by price. People have to factor in this kind of unpredictable, dangerous warning, or theoretically, yes. But it's not so theoretical either. I mean, Tel Aviv has been hit. So, I don't think that that's what you want for in what we call normal life. And that's the price, I think, that people have to incorporate this concern and anxiety in their life, and people have different ways of coping with it.
I think I'm curious how you think society as a whole is coping with. I mean, it's been huge convulsions over the last 2.5 years over the war, October 7th, which was massive, probably can't be overstated. How do you think now society is coping with everything that has happened?
Well, I think Israeli society now is at a certain point. I think since the ceasefire and the return of the last body, the body of the last hostage in Gaza, it's created a kind of sense of closure. I don't think it's a complete sense of closure, and it may be a false sense of closure because Gaza is still there. More than 2 million people are homeless. Babies have been dying of cold in the winter. There are still skirmishes between Hamas and Israeli forces. Civilians are still being killed in Gaza. I think Israelis really want to turn a page. They want to say, well, okay, now the hostages are back because that was the main concern here. And now it's time to heal. The narrative is, okay, now it's time to heal and to rebuild, and including demands by protesters for a state commission of inquiry into what happened on October 7th. But it's like trying to move on. And I'm not sure that's possible because even though all the hostages live and dead have been returned to Israel, recovered, the fact is that some of them were not, a large portion were not alive when they were returned. And there are questions lingering about why this happened and why were they taken hostage and why were people killed and what went on. There's the unfinished business in Gaza. The army is controlling a certain part of the territory, and it's unclear where we're going with that. There's a Trump plan, but it's hobbling along. It's not clear how much it will actually take place now that we've finished the first phase. So I think that with all the desire to turn a page and move on from Gaza, I don't think Israelis can move on yet because they still haven't resolved and reckoned with what happened on October 7th in an official way. I mean, there's a feeling that this needs to be investigated. The people responsible need to be called to account. All this hasn't happened. And so people are saying, okay, now that we've done with the hostage issue, our minds are free, or emotionally we're free now to deal now with these questions. But the point is that now it's time for a reckoning. That's kind of the mood in the country. And not even talking about the Palestinians right now.
Well, this was my question because you spoke about the Palestinians.
I did.
You spoke about Palestinians. Right. In the country, are people speaking about the Palestinians?
Yeah, no, they're not. I was saying that because looking at it as a journalist and seeing the complete picture. But I think in Israel, people are preoccupied with healing and fixing what went wrong and trying to get back into a better situation. And that can only be done through a reckoning and accounting for what happened in a real way. That hasn't been done yet because through the whole 2.5 plus years of the war in Israel, the preoccupation has been with the hostages, with the soldiers being killed and people who were killed on October 7th. I mean, if you listen to the media here, it was constantly rehearsing and interviewing relatives of people who were killed, relatives of hostages. It was the number one preoccupation, not the Palestinians. And, there's been criticism of that in the liberal media here, that the Israeli mainstream media, the TV channels, were not showing Israelis what was going on in Gaza. Or they're showing very little. Most of it.
But say you have a conversation with someone who is less liberal, more less journalistic, and you say, hey, by the way, this is the stuff that's been going on in Gaza, what is their reaction likely to be? And why do you think that is?
Well, I have friends, good friends, and I've been, because of the nature of my work, I've been exposed to all this stuff from Gaza and the videos and the news, and I just informally on WhatsApp, sometimes relay things to them, send them things. It's very interesting. Their move to respond has to do with the hostages, or it has to do with the Israeli concerns. On the Palestinian side, sometimes things like, this is really awful, the war has to end. But I would say their main concern, like right now, they're going to protest for a national commission of inquiry, an official commission of inquiry into what happened on October 7th. They're concerned with the Israeli narrative and Israeli concerns. They acknowledge what's going on in Gaza. They're not in denial, but I would say their emotional and intellectual focus is on how to fix what went wrong here. Even the enormous loss of life, civilian suffering in Gaza, acknowledged, but not the main preoccupation by a long shot. It just isn't.
But do you know why I find that challenging? And this is one of the things I struggle with when I'm speaking to people about Israel, because I care deeply for Israel. I lived there for 4 years. I think I know the heart of a lot of friends who I might struggle to say, like, look, this happened. And they'll tell me, no, that kid wasn't starving. It was made up. I don't know what is the disconnect, like what it would take for people to change. Like, it seems like a disconnect for people who are deeply caring and compassionate and community minded to not be able to put more care or narrative towards that next door suffering. And I'm wondering what it is socially or politically that makes that difficult.
I think, first of all, the trauma of October 7th, people were so shocked and grieving about that for so long. I mean, it was genuine. I think that it's hard to find the emotional bandwidth to deal, when you're so immersed in your own tragedy and you don't have the, what's the word, the emotional ability, maybe. I've heard, I spoke to a doctor who told me, and he actually says, I'm left of center, but I don't have any room. I can't have sympathy beyond what happened to us right now. He was just saying that. I mean, he's politically kind of on the left of center. He's not a right-winger, super nationalist. He was just saying, I don't have it in me right now. I can't feel, it's just, I'm so, he just felt so shocked by what happened. I think part of the explanation is that. And people also, really good Israeli journalists spoke on a panel that I heard recently, said that a lot of societies actually who've gone through, think about America after 9/11. How much sympathy was there for, civilians killed in the war on terror afterwards, what was called the war on terror, because people after 9/11, the Vietnam War ended because of the soldiers being killed, not what it was doing to the Vietnamese, I would say. I think in America, it was concerned with the losses of American troops, and it seemed pointless. It wasn't losses on the Vietnamese side. Yes, there was the My Lai massacre, and that was one incident, of course, that caused attention. But in general, the reason the U.S. society, I think, mobilized against the war, the protesters, a lot of it was just the price being paid by the U.S. and not so much by the Vietnamese. And so I think if you compare Israel to other societies, you can see some parallels there. Not making excuses. The only difference, I think the main difference is, though, that here it's, like you said, right next door. This is not thousands of miles away. This is literally an hour from Tel Aviv, or even less if you live further south from Tel Aviv. So this is literally happening on your doorstep. And if you're sitting at a cafe or a restaurant, I mean, I had this experience. It was very strange. Sitting with friends in Jaffa, which is, part of Tel Aviv, on the beach in Tel Aviv and having a nice lunch. And you know that an hour south of here, there's war and there are people without food. And sometimes you can hear when you're traveling, if you're on a hike or a walk in southern Israel, you can hear the booms, from the Gaza border of the artillery. You cannot escape it. It's there. And so I think it takes a lot of, I don't want to be harsh, but denial and repression maybe to be able to go on with your life without having that impinge all the time on your consciousness. And I think people do that. I think people here have become inured, because of the threats and because of the sirens and because of, people somehow repress certain things and keep going. And that's part of it's a national, I think Israelis have my friend would say, a black belt in this kind of stuff. It's like keeping going despite the external threats and also the horrors that are going on even an hour from where you are or less, and But there's room for criticism of that, of course. I mean, people, that's, again, a price people pay.
It's interesting, though, because I think that is one thing. So much of the world kind of started paying attention when October 7th happened. I remember when you and I were in Jerusalem, people being kind of like, oh, the Middle East, oh, like it's boring. And so I think people often don't realize that the story and the society and the psychology has been going on for a long time. That black belt was earned previously.
Right. Yes,
So
I think there's a history of, the conflict has been going on for a long time. Israel has had, I mean, there's peace with Jordan and Egypt, but there have been confrontations across with Hezbollah and in Gaza repeatedly. And so people have learned to live with that. But just the war was such a huge event, and the loss of life and suffering in Gaza was so tremendous that it was really an interesting case study to see how does a society deal with that, or how does a society move on with its life without really paying too much attention to it. I think the media played a big role here. The media, in terms of shielding Israelis from the consequences of what their government was doing. I think that Israelis did not see the tremendous suffering. You saw it more where you are, and people abroad saw it. Israelis did not. And so some of the reaction was, oh, they hate us. Why are they protesting over there? Why is everybody up in arms? Oh, some anti-Semitic, that's been used. People, they must hate us. They hate us for some reason. I don't know why. Because you're not seeing the implications, or you're not seeing the results of what your army is doing. Of course, Israelis can access foreign channels if they want. I think if people want to, they can seek it out. I just don't know how many people bothered to do that. So I think the media presentation of it, I'm talking about TV and mainly, and most mainstream media, except for the liberal paper Haaretz, which made it its business to cover the suffering in Gaza. The other media in Israel was very Israel-centered. The army, the stories of the soldiers, the stories of the hostages, the stories of their relatives. I mean, that's enough there to fill a whole program. It's a human drama of
the human drama on the Israeli side is enough. Yeah,
it's huge. And so it's like, what I'm saying is almost no room for any more suffering because we're so immersed in our own, that kind of thing. I mean, that's what was going on, I think. And you can be critical of that and say you're being insensitive and you're blinding yourself. But I think the broadcast media played a huge role in that here.
I think about where we are now and where society is now. And it is, I suppose, how does, this desire to move forward and heal and fix, what do people think will do? I mean, you mentioned the inquiry, but what else do people think is required for Israeli society to heal and move forward broadly?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think people feel there's a tremendous rift, between the right, I don't know how to call it. It's like, the right, the pro-Netanyahu crowd, the religious nationalist crowd, which saw the war as almost a moment of an opportunity, to defeat the enemy and win a great victory, a total victory over the evil Hamas. The more extreme among them were thinking already of resettling the Gaza Strip, maybe, because we'll stay there, and then maybe we can even set up civilian community, that kind of thing. That was the fringe. But you have a large portion of the public which is very nationalistic. The war made it, in a way, exacerbated that, because the attack by Hamas seems to me, instead of making a lot of Israelis rethink a lot of major issues and, we have to resolve this conflict with the Palestinians, no. It had the opposite effect. It was almost like circle the wagons. You see how brutal our enemies are. You see how bloodthirsty and evil they are. We need to survive, and we need to do what we need to do to survive. And it had the opposite effect. It almost entrenched this point of view of, we need to be tough, and we can't have sympathy for them. Even civilians there, it's just we can't afford it. It's too much of a threat. And so I think that had the effect on Israelis. Polls show now that the support among Israelis for a Palestinian state has really gone down. People feel it's too much of a risk. Withdrawing from the West Bank and allowing a Palestinian state there, and in Gaza or whatever, it's much less of a popular idea. So on one hand,
well, it wasn't a popular idea before, though. I would say that that's something I'm always telling people is there's this perception that somehow before October the 7th, this was something being discussed or on the table. And like you and I know, it wasn't. Nobody was in favor of it before.
Right. But if anything, this hardened the opposition among public. In public polls showing, an increase in, even drops even more. The concept of it now, it doesn't, in the Israeli public, it's just not seen as a viable way to go right now, especially after what happened on October 7th and what happened.
So what do they see as the way forward? What do you think? No, but genuinely, I'm curious because
I'll tell you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think it's
Yeah.
the election. I mean, the focus now, Israel has elections scheduled in November.
Again.
Yeah, again, yet again. But this time, the government basically lasted its full term. And now the argument is about change, the need to change the political leadership. That's the argument of the opposition, or the people who are opposed to the government, opposed to Netanyahu. We need part of the healing and the fixing means getting rid of the current government and having a different government. I don't know how different it'll be because a lot of the parties opposed to Netanyahu are also kind of on the right. They're not, it's kind of a choice between a variety of right-wing or center-right parties. There's only one really center-left party, which are called the Democrats. And they're like traditional left-wing or center Labor Party people. But the rest are varieties of right, soft right, more moderate right, and then Netanyahu's party. And so I think the focus now is shifting to first of all, what I mentioned before, accountability and a reckoning with what happened. And secondly, what do we do about the leadership? Does the leadership get a vote of confidence or does the leadership get turned out? People are going to vote them out of office. And then it'll be time to rebuild and to fix things.
Your average Israeli at a cafe, if we're at Cafe, one of my favorite places, and we say, okay, so what are we going to do to have lasting peace, to be safe here in Israel? What are they going to say?
It's tough. I mean, a lot of people have, as I said, I think the attack on October 7th and the war, it made a lot of people pessimistic. In other words, I think it made a lot of people feel that the level of animosity that was shown that day, I mean, it's just, don't see their way to reconciliation with that kind of enmity, that was shown on October 7th. And then if you want to get into the fine points, but that's Hamas. And then you have the Palestinian Authority. They, on the other hand, the PLO recognizes Israel, willing to negotiate with Israel. I find myself rehearsing this in conversations to people. Did you remember the Oslo Accord that the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist? Or Arafat wrote a letter to Rabin recognizing his right to live in peace and security. Of course, there have been so much since then, right? There were suicide bombings in Israel. There have been so much violence since then that it's kind of shattered a lot of people's faith in that agreement and the chances for a solution. Interestingly enough, the center-left candidate for the Democrats party here, they're called Democrats, Yair Golan, is saying separation. That's the word he's using. He's not using peace. He's not using two states in his camp, even though he may privately think that's the only way out. But he said in a recent interview that that's not going to sell right now. Israelis aren't ready for this emotionally. And so he talks about separation, which is another way of saying withdrawing from parts of the West Bank and getting behind the barrier Israel built there, which part of it's in the West Bank, but, separating from the Palestinians rather than a peace vision. So people are really, it's a kind of a hard-headed, I think, mood. It's like they don't see the way to shaking hands and making peace with the Palestinians right now. They just want to find some modus vivendi, status quo that lowers the violence. Of course, that's not the ultimate solution. That's not the solution. I mean, no,
but it's interesting just that
beyond that.
Yeah, it's interesting that that's the perspective, right? Is because I think a lot of people have this idea. They see what has happened in Gaza. If they tend to be critical of Gaza, or of Israel's actions in Gaza, or of Israel's actions towards the Palestinians, and they find it hard, I think sometimes for people, they're like, well, why don't they see this might be in their interest to have peace, or might be in their interest to negotiate? And it's a cognitive dissonance, I think, right? And you talk about the trauma, but it's also this cognitive dissonance of, this is what we want, but there's absolutely no way we'll do this thing.
I think people are afraid of, it's paradoxical. It's like the argument of the peaceniks here and they're a camp that's really become smaller.
I was going to say,
the only real security is through a political agreement. I mean, there's a sticker by a group called Women Make Peace. It's a grassroots movement of Israeli women who want a peace agreement. And their sticker says diplomatic or political agreement is a security step. In other words, that is arguing to Israelis that that's how they will get their security. You want security? That seems to be the main, people almost have an existential fear. You still see people walking with their rifles around. Like I saw two religious young men walk, after services on Shabbat, they had their rifles. They were in the army and they were taking their rifles to services, to prayers. And I asked them, why do you do that? You're on leave now. And they said, well, in case something happens, it's good to be able to respond. When something happens means if there'll be an attack, a Palestinian attack, if somebody will suddenly ram their car into people walking on the street or open fire, which there have been, we have had these attacks here. It's good to have somebody who can respond. That was their logic. I was just curious, why are they carrying their army issue rifles to services when they're in civilian clothes? And they said that they felt that this was almost like, a security blanket? Like, I need something that in case something happens, I can respond. It's an example, I think, of the anxiety that some people have, even when they're walking around daily life or going to services on Shabbat. Something might happen, and so I need to be prepared, that kind of thing.
I just want to ask that question, but do you think that Israelis feel the world understands that anxiety or fear?
Right. I think the general feeling among Israelis is that they're not understood. Again, as I said before, because I think Israelis haven't had receiving the full picture of what the implications of the war in Gaza, what that did to people in Gaza. I think that they sometimes feel there's kind of a unjustified hatred of Israel and Jews in general. They're not relating it to the Gaza war enough because they haven't maybe seen a lot or received a lot of information about what's going on in Gaza. And there's a sense that there's a certain hostility there toward the Jews and the Jewish state. And they don't make the connection to the Gaza war necessarily. And for example, Israeli singers in the Eurovision contest, there are countries that pulled out of that competition because Israel is competing. The Israeli team at the Winter Olympics, there were some boos in the stadium when they marched in. And this is reported here. And it's like, you see, they don't like us. They don't like us, and it's tough for us when we're outside the country because people don't like us. And people don't make the connection necessarily when it's reported that way. The connection isn't made, they don't like us because they've seen images from Gaza of wounded civilians and killed civilians and children without food and hunger. And, the connection isn't made to the war. And I think it needs to be. I think people have to be told this negative reaction is connected to the conflict and what happened over the last 2.5 years and the tremendous destruction and loss of life in Gaza. And that has raised a lot of opposition to Israel around the world. And here it's all conflated. I mean, if you listen to the broadcast or even print media descriptions of it, the mainstream, it's anti-Israel hatred, it's anti-Jewish hatred. It's gotten worse since October 7th without saying why it's gotten worse since October 7th. There was October 7th, and then there was a surge in anti-Israeli and anti-Jewish incidents around the world. Yes, but there was a war in Gaza and things happened in Gaza. That's often not mentioned.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the view from here, I think, that a lot of people have, that there is no understanding. And also, there is a feeling that October 7th, of course, each side in the conflict feels that their suffering is not paid attention to. Palestinians feel that way, and Israelis also feel that it took the world, for example, too long, the United Nations and women's groups, to condemn sexual violence in the Hamas assault. It took them too long. There's a feeling that, there was some kind of a bias and that it took these groups too long to acknowledge that sexual violence was perpetrated during the Hamas attack. And there's still a grudge there. And so I still do feel Israelis have a feeling that they're being unfairly dealt with abroad.
There does always seem to be a bit of a zero-sum game. I mean, you and I know this from covering the Middle East for a long time, right? Like, you cannot have, and when we try to talk about this now, that if you have compassion for one side, you're not having enough compassion for the other. If you acknowledge what is a fact on the ground in one experience and a fact on the ground for another experience, you have somehow violated the truth. It always seems to, or justifying it, right? Like,
I mean, we always say it's information, it's not justification. But but you're just trying to justify, that's that kind of.
Is it hard to be having those conversations? You talked about rehearsing the facts. Like, does that get tiring?
Well, I mean, I don't get tired doing it because I feel it's really important that my friends and my circle of friends and acquaintances and people be aware of what's going on. And I feel that sometimes, I've been privileged because of my position working for foreign press and, we in the BBC and other places, get materials from we see things that maybe ordinary people here who consume news, even if they are watching some foreign coverage, they're not always seeing that. And so I always feel that it's important to make them aware. I'm not preaching. I don't want to get it, tell people what to think or preach to them. And certainly, wearing a journalist hat, we don't do that. We just try to give the information and let them. And
preaching doesn't convert anyone. It really doesn't.
Right. But I've often found that it doesn't evoke, I don't know, some of the, let's say it this way, the uncomfortable information, right? I often, sometimes when people get upset about the reporting and, oh, he's just out to prove that Israel's committing war crimes, I'm saying, look, it's inconvenient reporting. I understand that. It's disturbing. It shows, by the way, that the person I'm talking to was disturbed by it and upset by it, and he had to put it in some kind of, he had to make a statement about it, like, oh, he's just looking to, I mean, if he didn't care, he wouldn't say that. I think that it does hit home in some way. But the conversations are often just to make people aware and just understand what the implications are. Because I think people here naturally react to the Israeli issues, the hostages, their families. It was a huge story. I don't, it was something the country never experienced before. But it's important to let people, to have people be aware of the larger, complete picture of what's going on.
I think it is also, though, important to try and help the world see what it looks like if you have hundreds of your own people missing, and if you have been attacked in a way that you've never been attacked, like that does do something to your psyche too. So if you're not ever seeing what's happening, what your army is doing, or what your government is doing, I think it's important to understand the perspective on both sides, right? Like it
right. No, I agree. And I think
like I would say, like, I think people look sometimes, some of the people I talk to who are very critical of how the government conducted the war in Gaza. And so when I say to them, oh, I love Israel, I loved living there, they look at me like I have two heads. And because they are unable to separate what they have seen in Gaza from they are unable to separate that from the humanity of an individual Israeli. And they're unable to imagine that their government could do something really awful and that they could still be kind of innocent of it and maybe fall for it.
I think that, again, the comparison that I told you before that I heard an Israeli journalist make, actually, but, other societies that have gone through this, you see parallel reactions. I mentioned 9/11. I mentioned, trying to remember now. Yeah,
Vietnam War was, I think, you mentioned the Vietnam War, I think, is a really...
Vietnam War, where the concerns for the lives of the soldiers was the number one issue, that our boys are dying for nothing. And it wasn't because of the Vietnamese. And I don't think that people were losing sleep over, I think, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, certainly maybe the hard left protesters, but the main issue was the troops. And I think that, so compared to other societies, you could say, well, it's parallel. Other societies in crisis who've been in conflict, this is a reaction. This is how people react. And they're concerned first and foremost with their own flesh and blood and their own people. And only later do they care about the others. As we said before, the difference is that this is right on your doorstep.
Yeah. And the difference is that Israel has a lot more power in this case. Like Israel has, like it does, like as a fact, it has more power.
And another point I think is worth mentioning is that it affects many. A lot of people participate in it because there's universal conscription. People, their kids serve in the army. A lot of them do reserve duty. So they've seen this firsthand, maybe they've served in Gaza. Maybe a lot of people walking on the street have been in Gaza in their, either conscripted as reservists. They've done stints there, or they have children or nephews who've been there. So it's not like something like maybe the American Army, certainly when I grew up, I didn't know anybody was in the service.
But are those conversations happening? Are your friends, are people, like you say, are those conversations happening?
I don't know. I don't think that the soldiers and the folks who have served in Gaza go back and at the Friday night Shabbat table talk about what they saw and what they did. I think it's like the last thing they want to talk about when they come home, right? They want to forget that, whatever it was, and they want to just be with their families and their girlfriends and be home and be with the family and try to be normal, because they've just come from hell on earth, right? Even, I'm saying the soldiers also are going through a lot of, in Israel, there's been a lot of reporting about trauma that soldiers have been through. Any war causes trauma to everyone. So I don't think enough of that conversation is going on. I don't think, I saw for example, there was a food truck in our neighborhood, and the kid behind the counter said, people came over, they kind of knew him. They said, "Hi, how you doing? So you finished with the army?" He said, "No, not yet. I have another 3 months." And he said, "Oh, where were you?" "I was in Gaza." And that kind of ended right there. And it wasn't like, what did you see? What did you do? What went on? No, it was just, okay, well, hopefully, you'll get through it and you'll come home. It's like, I think a lot of this stuff is not being processed. And there are a lot of issues here, of course, of PTSD among people who've served there and come back with all kinds of, experiences that have scarred them. There's acknowledgement of that. Again, the Israeli price, not talking about the Palestinians here.
No, but we're talking about that Israeli side. Like that is, I think,
Right. So
I
the
understand your
concern is,
framing.
so people are talking here about that, about the effect it has had on people who had to serve there, what it was like for them to come home from that, and things that they may have done. There's a phrase here used, moral injury. When you act against your own moral principles, you're in a situation where you find yourself doing things that don't really go with your value system. That may not be true of everybody. I'm not saying that's universal, but some people experience that. There may have been other people that were acting out when they were in the army and acting on their own ideology and beliefs. But I don't see much conversation about that. In other words, what did you do there? Why did you do it? What was it like? What did you see? Maybe people are having this at home and intimate settings, but I mean, in terms of public discourse, I'm not seeing much of that. The only discussion is about the traumatized people, that the traumatized people need treatment and they're getting help, that kind of thing.
So yeah, it hasn't, the idea of healing and fixing society hasn't yet moved to the soldiers who were part of the war.
Well, I mean, not yet. I mean, people are aware that there are people who've been emotionally scarred by this, but the healing and fixing that people are talking about more is more societal. It's like the government, the leadership, the way the country is going. Israeli character, I don't know what that is. There's different Israelis. I think the main part is that Israel is, it's not a monolith. It's anything but. It's like different tribes and different types of people. And that's the main thing I think about Israel that people maybe miss. Israel is not their government necessarily. The Israeli political system produced this government, but that doesn't mean that Israelis, as you said, are Bibi and Smotrich types. There are parts of the population that are, right-wing religious nationalists, and they're extreme types. There is a group like that. In America, we have Trump supporters. We have, we have groups, but in Israel, it's very much not monolithic. In other words, you have types like that. Then you have right-wing people who are not necessarily extreme right-wing. They're more moderate. They don't like that Netanyahu is undermining the judicial system. They're conservative, but they're not against the judiciary, and they're not against judicial oversight of the government, okay? You have different shades. You have immigrants from the former Soviet Union who have their own take on things, and what do they think about democracy, and having come from a very authoritarian system where they grew up, or where they came, or they're descendants of people who came from there. They're Ethiopian immigrants. There are so many subgroups in Israel. There are ultra-Orthodox Jews whose agenda is completely different. They're focused on Torah study, on religious studies, and avoiding military service. That's their number one, the hot button issue right now. Protesting in the streets against conscription. It's a vibrant kind of multi-ethnic and very loud society where arguments are going on about all kinds of things. Not only Gaza. Gaza is one huge topic, but there are many things, religion and state, again, the issue of conscription of the Orthodox, all kinds of social gaps, the role of women. I mean, you name it. I mean, in many ways, Israel always says that it's the only democracy in the Middle East. I think that has taken a beating recently. And certainly when you have an occupation in the West Bank, it's hard to say that it's a democracy, it's a complete democracy, because there is military control of millions of Palestinians. But within the Jewish Israeli society, and I would also say Israeli Arab are part of that, or Palestinian Israelis, whatever people call them, are part of the discussion. Right now, for example, I'll just give an example. There was a very big demonstration in Tel Aviv by Arab Israelis against what they say is government inaction regarding violent crime in Arab communities. There's been a record number of people murdered this year so far. Basically saying the government and the police are not doing enough. They don't care enough about Arab on Arab violence. They care about Arab Jewish violence, but they're not doing stuff about Arab on Arab violence. And we're citizens, and these are our communities, and people are getting shot in broad daylight and at night at all times of the day, and the government isn't doing anything. What was interesting about that protest was that a lot of Jews came to the protest. They did it deliberately in Tel Aviv. They wanted to do it in the heart of the most Israeli of Israeli cities, speaking Arabic, giving speeches in Arabic, chanting slogans in Arabic, but also in Hebrew. They did it. It was a bilingual demonstration. Many Jewish Israelis showed up in sympathy. One woman held up a sign that said, we're with you. A woman who lost a son to this violence was kind of tearfully speaking, and then the crowd started chanting, we're with you, which were the Jewish people in the crowd. So it's interesting. You have people who care about that also among Jewish Israelis, not only Arab Israelis. So the country is really a very It's a real mixture of all kinds of issues and debates going on. And I think, of course, that's lost in the polarized debate, especially around Gaza. And the voices being heard by the government don't necessarily represent the broad spectrum of the population. I mean, you've got all kinds of people. And you've got people who are going about their business. They maybe not be going to protest against the war, but they don't think what's going on in Gaza is good. I think a lot of people, if you would ask them, they would say, yes, it's very sad. It's interesting how a society continues functioning and goes about their daily life when this is going on right next to it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's what I'm curious about. And also that there is, that society does continue in it, like it has to, right? People have to continue to go to work, to get married, to
deal with their
raise
children.
Kids.
It's a very child-oriented society. The government encourages, helps with, fertility treatments. I mean, I know having children is kind of a national, maybe this is a holdover, of course, from the Holocaust. And, and now the country's getting pretty crowded and it's hitting like 10 million people in a very small slice of earth. And, things are crowded, like on weekends when people go out on hikes and go to the beach. I mean, things can get really crowded. And so the question is, like you said, you have to deal with your kids. You have to take care of daily life. And the weight of these huge issues sitting on the country, people don't always walk around all day with that baggage and carrying that huge thing on their shoulders. They got to pick up the kid from kindergarten and, make sure your husband gets there. And, it's just logistics. I mean, I remember my own kids. It's like logistics. And we don't have time now to deal with profound questions at the moment. It's a small country with these profound issues that are impinging on people's lives. And they can't always have time for that, because they have to deal with with immediate realities. There's your job, there's your work, whatever you're doing in life, what gives you meaning in life.
When did you arrive in Israel? When did you?
I was a high school student. I was a teenager. My parents.
Yeah. Okay. So you arrive as a teenager, and if you think about your experience as a teenager to now, what do you find the most different? How do you find the country the most different, and how do you find it the most the same?
Well, I would say, first of all, the same in terms of the community part. Okay, community, child-centered, almost to the point of over-involvement in everybody's issues. Very tight society. My father used to say it's like with your brother. Like when you have a fight with your brother, you allow yourself to say things you might not say to a stranger. So people allow themselves and take liberties in terms of saying things to each other, positive and negative, including involvement in your personal life or making a comment about this or when you're going to have another kid. Is it about time you had a kid or another kid? Things that maybe in other societies because they're inappropriate, invasive, too much in your face. It's kind of familiarity, I would say that that's been there all along. What's changed is really, as I said, the general climate. The general political climate. I think it's been exacerbated by the unresolved conflict that just goes on, and it has a corrosive effect, I think, on people's attitudes. I don't know. I think it's hard. I think when soldiers are serving in the West Bank, which is basically an occupation, the experiences that they have, as I said, it's a small enough country that people are personally affected. They have children or nephews, or maybe the person himself does reserve duty. They're exposed to these realities directly. And I think over time, it's made Israelis more defensive of their country. There's an increased sense of danger. After the Oslo Accords, there was a sense, we're resolving the conflict. Now the country can move to religious, secular tensions, social gaps within the country. The external issue is less important. Well, that didn't happen. Despite the Oslo Accords, the external conflict is still very much there. Israelis are dealing with always the possibility of an attack within the country by Palestinian attackers. They're not at peace. It's not calm enough. And I think that's and the continuing conflict has had an effect on people as hardened attitudes. It's just made hardened attitudes in Israel. I think it has. For the people on the left and the people who are promoting peace, they keep saying, well, that just makes it all the more reason we have to reach a peace agreement. But they've become a smaller minority. Yeah. If you look at the makeup in terms of the polls, in terms of parliament, in terms of the street, those people who are talking about that peace is the solution to this, the peaceniks have become a smaller group. They're small. Also politically, there's only one real party right now that's competing on that, more or less on that platform.
It's interesting. I'm not sure a lot of my Jewish friends in the diaspora realize how small the left wing and the kind of peaceniks are within Israel.
They definitely, they used to be, in the days of Rabin, when he was making the Oslo Accords, you had a government that had Labor Party. It was in coalition with left parties. There was talk about a new era, maybe, and moving toward reconciliation with the Palestinians. Now we're in a state where a situation where people they don't see their way to that right now. As I said, after the Gaza war, I think attitudes have become much harder. People are more hawkish. They're more concerned about survival. The situation with Iran hasn't helped. The fact that there was a 12-day war with Iran and missiles hit Israeli cities, it make people feel more conciliatory. I mean, I think that there's a general sense that the country is at risk. And this is the messaging that Netanyahu is constantly hammering home, that we live in a tough neighborhood and therefore it needs to be tough. But there's the consistent voice of the peace camp, which is saying, no, that the solution is not more military action or more wars or more offensive military attacks in different fronts in Lebanon and Syria and Gaza. It's moving toward diplomatic solution. But that's the peace camp, and that camp is circumscribed. It's not the majority. I think the majority here feel it's a tough neighborhood and we have to do what we need to do to survive, even though there are different shades of that.
Different shades.
It's not like everybody. Certainly, there's war weariness. I mean, I think people, even people who went to the war, served in reserves. I mean, they're worn out. I think a lot of people would say that's not a way forward. That's not a solution. But I don't think the country has articulated what its alternative is, and there's a lack of political leadership to articulate that. That's sad, because there is yet to emerge a political leader really who has articulated an alternative vision to the Netanyahu vision.
How has this conflict impacted you? Because you say you're a journalist, but you're also living it. How has this conflict impacted you?
I'm really practiced at separating my personal life or my personal issues from work. And work was, we're doing this as journalists, we're observing, we're talking to other people. We're not the story. But I mean, as we've mentioned in our off the record, in our own conversations, for example, in the last year, my last few months, my son and my daughter-in-law, who lived in Tel Aviv and with their 3 small children, have moved away. They moved to the Washington area in the States because the life in Tel Aviv was good for them with their children, but the realities of the sirens and the alarms were rattling too much. And with 3 small children, I think the feeling was that it would be better at this time to be in a place where there's less of that stress and anxiety. And so that's affected us personally in the sense that we don't have the grandchildren here right now. Understand what's behind it. It's harder for us as grandparents, but and by the way, it's a good example of what a lot of young Israeli families have been going through. My son and daughter-in-law have told me that a lot of discussions they had with friends at their age group with little children have been about this question, about how do you deal with the overall situation in the country, the sirens, the warnings, the missiles occasionally when they came in, and living a normal life with your kids here. And, the idea of moving abroad is something that's come up. It's discussed. Hard to put numbers on it. There have been statistical reports about a negative, that more people have left than have come in. Is there a brain drain going on? Certain people in academics, are they looking abroad right now? Because it's not a good time. It hasn't been the last 2.5 years. Have not been good here in that sense. So yeah, on a personal level, that was an example. Of course, the sirens, we all go into the safe room and we have a shelter. And even though you're writing about it as a journalist and reporting about it, you yourself have, you have your family and we had guests and we had to go into the safe room. And, these are personal experiences. So it does impact you personally. And I think the move of the kids was, a big, I don't call it a wake-up call because I'm totally aware of what's going on, but it shows you where a lot of people are, where they're thinking really deeply about their quality of life and what does life mean here? What sacrifices are you willing or not willing to make because of the ongoing conflict? And it raises a lot of questions about that. Yeah. And some people there's no one correct answer. Everybody reacts in different ways. You can stay and fight for what you believe in and join the protests and do what you can to ameliorate the situation. Other people feel it's too much and they need to get out for a while or whatever. I mean, it's not an answer. There's no one answer for everyone. Everybody has their own answer for how they cope with a situation like that. But the country's been in very big crisis for a long time, and then it affects people's plans regarding their lives. Definitely.
Well, I know your plan was to spend lots of time with the grandkids, right? So.
Yeah. So for me, I mean, that's unfortunate, but it's a mixed feeling. So on the one hand, I understand what's behind it. I completely can relate to that. On the other hand, missing that. And so in a way, and I think I read a letter to the editor by a woman who wrote to the Haaretz newspaper. She said she has 5 children and 3 of them are now abroad and that she's going to a psychologist to help herself process this. And she was very frank about it in her letter and said that she understands why they did it because they want to have, it's been she called it a bloodbath here, meaning all the violence that's happened, including Gaza and everything that's gone on, and she understands why for them and for their humanity and for the humanity of their children they felt they needed to be elsewhere. It was a very interesting letter, but it was an example of the kind of debates that are going on among families. And we have a lot of friends our age, who have kids that have, some of their children have relocated, some have not, but it is a live issue here. It's under discussion after the last 2.5 years or more, actually.
I'm going to keep prying you into personal space. You're such a great journalist, which is why I've always been grateful to have your counsel. Let's look ahead 10 years. What is your hope for the Israel your grandchildren will have?
Well, I mean, I think the main problem, the conflict, is the core issue influencing life here right now. And I think the resolution of the conflict there has to be resolved. I don't think people said that October 7th proved that you can't manage the conflict. There was the idea here, and it was propagated by, writers, intellectuals, and some people in government, you can manage the conflict. Conflict is insoluble, so we'll manage it. We'll try to reduce friction. We'll build a wall or a fence between us and the West Bank. We'll keep Gaza, more or less separate and isolated, and we'll get on with our lives. Occasionally there'll be the occasional attack. We can deal with that. We'll crack down the armies in the West Bank. It'll do raids, and somehow the conflict can be managed, and people will be able to go about their daily life with a reasonable amount of security and safety. And because we can't solve it, it's not soluble. It's just the demands on the Palestinian side are too great, and we're not willing to give up certain things. And that was kind of a very prevalent idea. And October 7th, the people have been saying showed that it's not that you can manage, because if you let it simmer, this is what happens. It erupts like that. Has the Israeli public reached that conclusion? I don't think so, because you asked us before about whether Israelis are drawing that conclusion. Some people are saying this. They're saying, you see, this shows you can't manage this indefinitely. But I mean, in my own personal view is that without resolution of that biggest of questions, the issue of the conflict with the Palestinians, there won't be, the country will never be at peace and it will never have a fully, normal, whatever normal is, existence, because of the constant conflict, which is constantly coming up. Israelis may experience it in attacks by Palestinians in their cities, on the streets. They may experience it through their army service. Palestinians, of course, are experiencing it all the time with the Israeli occupation in the West Bank. So, for Israel to be truly, at peace or secure, I mean, it has to resolve the conflict. And I think that that's something maybe a lot of people kind of theoretically know, but their fears right now prevent them from acknowledging it enough. But if I look ahead, like you're saying, 10 years ahead, that would be in the world. If my grandchildren were here and if they were going to live here, that would be, a resolution of the conflict. That is the ultimate, in a way that would end, Israel's occupation in the West Bank is resolved in some way, that there's some kind of accommodation reached. That, to me, that's key. I mean, and October 7th showed that that's key to any future normality here, is resolving this conflict. Living with the idea, there are people who believe here in Israel that Israel has no choice. It has to live, what they say in Hebrew, to live on the sword, it has to simply put up its defenses and carve out for itself. There's a phrase that's used a lot also in the media, a villa in the jungle. It's a jungle out there, and we have to make our house as safe and secure as we can. And there's no talk of accommodation. It's just making sure that you're safe enough in a hostile environment. And I don't think that that's sustainable. I think we've seen that that's not sustainable. And so, I've been very, very careful about expressing a point of view in my work, but you're getting this out of me, and I'm acknowledging that. To me, that's the key, is resolving the conflict. That is the key to the future of the country, really, in my opinion.
And the future of the country is what you see for your grandkids.
Well, so, I mean,
that's what I was asking you.
If children and grandchildren are going to have a future here, my children, I also have, grown-up children that are thinking about where they're going to end up living, and for them to live here in a place that I hope will be a place where they can, pursue a life with meaning and a life that is, well, what's the word? I keep using the word normal, but I'm saying that it's free of everything that's going on right now. It's to resolve the conflict with the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. There's just no way out. That's since the inception of Israel, that's been the issue. And as long as it remains unresolved, there will be constant crisis and fear and concern for safety.
What is the overarching emotion? Like, if you were going to name the emotion that you have most days right now, what would be the emotion you have most days living in Israel, doing what you do?
So let's say you're planning a trip. We're planning a trip in several weeks. Okay, are the flights going to have? Is the airport going to be functioning? What's going to be going on here at the time? Are we going to be able to fly? Will the airport be shut? Will there be threats on? Will airlines be canceling their service to Israel? I mean, we've had many times in the last 2.5 years where foreign airlines canceled their service here. American Airlines. But no, I mean United. You give a lot of examples.
Air Canada,
United, Delta, European Airlines. So Israelis are big travelers because they live in this pressure cooker, and they really love to travel, and they fly a lot to Europe and to the States and everywhere. They fly to Asia and Thailand and the Far East. Anyway, so for that, it's like a lifeline, right? And when airlines start canceling, it increases the sense of isolation. And so I'm just giving that as an example of uncertainty. Okay, it's really it has to do with a trip abroad, but in general, it's like it's hard to know what comes next. It's hard to know what comes next. And also in Gaza, what will be happening in Gaza? Will that settle, or will that continue to fester? Will that continue to be a military confrontation? In general, I think there's a sense, especially after the last 2.5 years, the unthinkable has happened. And when you think something's unthinkable, and then it happens, and then it's like, oh, I never thought that Israel would strike Iran's nuclear facilities. It did. There was actually a war, and Israel and the U.S. struck Iran's nuclear facilities. This was thought of as some kind of apocalyptic thing that would happen in the fairly distant future, and that might risk a World War III. And it actually did happen. So the unthinkable can happen. That is part of the reality now.
That pulls the rug out. That does pull the rug out. Yeah.
So, I mean, and the leadership in the U.S., leadership in Israel right now, nothing is beyond... Nothing is inconceivable, it seems, anymore. Things can happen. I mean, there's a joke that there's a satire. I mean, journalists, we know there's the Onion, which is a satire.
Oh, website. Yeah.
Reality has far outstripped the Onion. I mean, the satire. I mean, you can't even imagine some of it. So, I mean, I think uncertainty and a sense of being unsure about what comes next is very much out there. I mean, I feel it. A lot of people feel it. Yeah. I think it's an overwhelming sense here.
What is, and a final personal one, with everything, if you were doing what do you love most about Israel to someone who doesn't know the country, who hasn't been, what do you love most about your home?
Well, I think the familiarity is what it's familiarity and community. I think I think maybe you also sensed that when you were here. I think that in larger countries and maybe other societies where people are more reserved, or I mean, the fact that I mean, we've had our own community of friends. A lot of them happen to be people who came from the States because we're we're similar backgrounds, but we've all integrated here, and we have children that were born here and part of the country and gone to the Israeli school system, and so we're integrated. But I think that what I find that always attractive, that I felt attractive about the place was that the familiarity and the informality of the country and of the society and the way people and the sense of community. That's all coming under a lot of pressure now because of everything that's been going on, and it raises a lot of questions about it. What is this community? What is this community about right now? Huge questions. But on the everyday, I'm just talking on the micro level, on the immediate level. Friends, family, geographic closeness. You're never too far from your kids, really, because nothing is really more than 2 hours away, usually, in the geographics of the country. You don't have kids that live on the, of course, if your children move abroad, that's a different question. But as long as you have family in this country, you're never too far from each other either. And I think that's also a big deal, because in the States, all the people are very, very, thousands of miles away from each other, even though they're in the same family. And here you're pretty much within striking distance. There's pluses and minuses to that, of course, but it is
always close enough to give your opinion in person.
Right, exactly. But it's part of it. It's part of the the fact that it's a small, geographically small, and also in terms of population, it's not a huge, vast country, and so there's a lot of connections, either direct, familial, or people who know people, and it's very familiar. Everybody's, it's like nothing happens without somebody knowing somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who has a personal connection with somebody, and it's very useful to journalists to try to get to the politicians or other people. But there's a network there of a lot of acquaintances and circles of familiarity, from your closest familial circle, friends, acquaintances, etc. So that, yeah, it's very much like that. So that I would say that those are the things that are appealing. But in the crisis over the last 2.5 years has had an unmistakable impact on all that and raises a lot of questions about that.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
So
I'm not
what
trying to
next?
Pollyanna it. It's just more of a, if I tell people that the sense of community is a thing, it's not the same as if somebody who's Israeli and lives there tells them. So, but it's definitely something that I felt and kind of definitely impacted how what I look for in my life or what I value, that community that I saw and experienced.
Right. So yes. So, but I'm just saying that all that, it's been
Has
really
come
shaken.
under pressure. Everything it's
Two and a half
been
years, it's shaken a lot of
shaped and
things. Like,
changed. Yeah.
what is this? What is going on here? What does this mean? What is about the future of ourselves and our children, our grandchildren here? What does that all mean? It's really, a lot of people are going through this now in Israel. I think a lot of people on a very
Really
personal level.
existential questions. Those are big questions, as you
They
say.
are big questions.
Yeah.
You can't exaggerate the impact of what happened. Yeah, definitely.
Joel, thank you so much. I am grateful that you are in my circle. You have
Me
shared.
as well. Thank you very much, Melanie. It was good talking.
Thank you for all the insight. Thank you for the wisdom. And thank you for letting me pry out a few personal details. It is useful and helpful to everyone watching. Like, subscribe, drop a comment in. I'll be in there. You never know, I might get Joel in to answer one or two. And we appreciate you so much. Thank you.